Josh Hawley thought his bill targeting social media algorithms was a win against big tech, until Jasmine Crockett brought a Missouri-based app developer to a House hearing whose small business was bankrupted by it. Within minutes of the confrontation, the clip detonated online. C-SPAN, a network typically relegated to the background hum of government life, was suddenly the source of the most replayed video in the country. On X, formerly Twitter, #HawleySlaw and #CrockettConfronts were locked in a dead heat for the top trend. News producers scrambled to recut their evening rundowns, bumping scheduled segments for panel discussions about the exchange. It wasn't just another moment of political theater. It was a 5-minute masterclass in accountability, broadcast live from the heart of a system that rarely saw it. The footage was raw, unscripted, and devastatingly direct, showing a powerful senator's grand vision colliding with the ruined life of a single, forgotten citizen. 2 days earlier, the hearing was nothing more than a scheduled victory lap on Senator Josh Hawley's calendar. He sat in his leather chair in the Russell Senate office building, the room a quiet testament to power, all dark wood and flags. He scanned the prepared testimony for the House Energy and Commerce Committee, though he hardly needed it. The words were his own, polished by his staff, but forged in his own populist ideology. His signature legislation, the Freedom to Compete Act, had passed the Senate months ago, with bipartisan fanfare he'd manufactured, by framing it as a patriotic crusade against Silicon Valley censorship. The House version was now being debated, and his appearance was meant to be the final push, a show of senatorial gravitas to shepherd his creation into law. An aide, a young man named Marcus with sharp lapels and an even sharper ambition, placed a fresh cup of coffee on the coaster beside him. "The latest polling on the act is through the roof, Senator," Marcus said, his voice gleaming. "Independents love it. They see you as the only one willing to take on the tech tyrants." Hawley gave a slight, satisfied nod. He'd built his career on this narrative: David versus a series of Goliaths. The media, the universities, the globalists, and now, the tech barons of California. He believed it completely. He was the defender of the common man. Another aide, this one more senior and less prone to sycophancy, cleared his throat from the doorway. "Just a heads up, Senator. We've received another batch of correspondence from small developers about the compliance burdens of the act. Mostly from your home state, actually. They're claiming the algorithmic audit requirements are financially prohibitive." Hawley waved a dismissive hand without looking up from his papers. "Whining," he said, the word clipped and final. "That's the cost of entering the arena. If you can't afford to certify your product is safe for American consumers, you shouldn't be in the market. This is about weeding out the weak players who piggyback on dangerous code. It's exactly what the law is designed to do." The senior aide held his gaze for a moment, then retreated, the objection noted and discarded. To Hawley, these complaints were insignificant static, the inevitable grumbling of a few who couldn't adapt. He was fighting a war of ideas, of national character. There would always be collateral damage. The hearing, he thought, would be an excellent opportunity to reiterate that point. He would be firm, resolute. He would talk about the forgotten man of Missouri, the one he was protecting from digital manipulation, not the one complaining about paperwork. Across the city, in a much smaller, more functional office in the Longworth House office building, Jasmine Crockett was staring at her laptop, the glow illuminating a face set with a familiar, flinty resolve. She wasn't reading polling data or a prepared speech. She was reading an email, a long, desperate, meticulously detailed email forwarded to her by a former law school classmate who now ran a legal aid clinic in St. Louis. The subject line was stark: "Urgent case study, the real-world impact of the Freedom to Compete Act." The author of the email was a man named Leo Vance. He described himself as a 42-year-old software developer from Columbia, Missouri. He had spent 5 years and his entire life savings building an app called Hobby Hub. It was a simple, wholesome concept, an application designed to connect people in the same geographic area based on shared interests like model rocketry, quilting circles, birdwatching, and hiking clubs. It was the antithesis of the toxic, algorithm-fueled outrage machines of big tech. It was local, it was community, and it was dead. According to Leo's email, his simple recommendation engine, which suggested quilting in Jefferson City to a user who liked sewing in Colombia, was technically defined as a behavioral amplification algorithm under the sweeping language of Hawley's law. To comply, he was required to hire a federally approved third-party auditor to conduct a $75,000 annual review to ensure his app wasn't unduly influencing user behavior or suppressing expression. The threat of non-compliance was a fine of up to $2 million and potential criminal liability. His investors, a small group of local business owners, had pulled their funding immediately. He had tried to raise the money for the audit, but no one would touch a company with that kind of regulatory sword hanging over its head. He had been forced to declare bankruptcy 3 weeks ago. The email ended with a line that seized Crockett's attention. Senator Hawley says he wrote this law for people like me. I live 10 minutes from his state office. I have called 37 times. I have sent 17 letters. No one will respond. They told me he's a federal senator and doesn't handle individual cases. Crockett, the former public defender, felt a cold fire ignite in her gut. She knew this story. It was the same story she had seen play out in courtrooms for years. A person without power, without connections, being ground to dust by a system designed by people who never had to look their victims in the eye. The abstract language of the law, compliance burdens, regulatory frameworks, became the concrete reality of a man's life's work being erased. She picked up her phone, not to call a staffer, but to dial the number Leo Vance had left at the bottom of his email. He answered on the first ring, his voice wary. "Mr. Vance," she began, her tone direct and devoid of political artifice. "My name is Jasmine Crockett. I'm a congresswoman from Texas, but I read your story." There was a pause. Yes, ma'am," he stammered. "I don't understand." "I do," Crockett said. "I understand perfectly. Senator Hawley is scheduled to testify before my committee in 2 days to talk about the success of his bill." She let that hang in the air. "Can you be in D.C. in 2 days? My office will cover the flight and hotel." I think it's time the senator heard from the people his laws actually affect. For a moment, there was only stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then, a choked voice. "Yes," Leo Vance said. "God, yes. I'll be there." When Crockett hung up, she looked at the hearing schedule on her desk. It wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a battlefield. The House Energy and Commerce Committee hearing room was a study in controlled, wood-paneled tension. The cameras were on, the microphones were hot, and the tiered dais was filled with representatives shuffling papers and whispering to aides. Jasmine Crockett sat at her assigned seat, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. In the front row of the public gallery, directly in her line of sight, sat Leo Vance. He wore an ill-fitting suit he had clearly bought for the occasion, and he clutched a thin manila folder on his lap, as if it were a life raft. He looked pale, terrified, and utterly out of place. He was the physical embodiment of the abstraction they were all there to debate. Senator Josh Hawley entered the room with the easy confidence of a man visiting a foreign but friendly court. As a senator, his presence in a House hearing was a notable event, and the Republican members on the committee greeted him with a deference that bordered on reverence. He shook hands, smiled his practiced, earnest smile, and took his seat at the witness table. He was alone, without notes or aides, a deliberate choice to project total command of his subject. The committee chairman, a Republican from Michigan, gave a glowing introduction, praising Hawley's courage and intellectual leadership in crafting the Freedom to Compete Act. Hawley nodded humbly. The stage was set. His testimony was a masterstroke of political oratory. He spoke without a script. his gaze sweeping across the room, his voice resonating with conviction. He painted a vivid picture of an America under siege from coastal elites and their technological tools of manipulation. He spoke of children being addictively programmed, of conservative voices being silenced, of the very fabric of American discourse being torn apart by faceless corporations. And so, we in the Senate acted, he declared, his voice rising. We acted to put the American people back in control of their own minds, their own lives. He leaned into the microphone. This law, the Freedom to Compete Act, he said, the words rolling out with triumphant finality, has unleashed a new era of market competition, giving small, patriotic innovators a chance to build platforms that honor American values. As he said it, his eyes briefly passed over the front row, over the pale face of Leo Vance, registering nothing. He saw a crowd, not a casualty, on the dais. Crockett watched the exchange, her gaze like a pinpoint of ice. She saw the flicker of pain in Leo's eyes as Hawley unknowingly celebrated on the grave of his life's work. The questioning began predictably. Republicans served him softballs. Senator, could you expand on how this law protects our children? Senator, can you tell the American people what you'd say to the big tech lobbyists who oppose this common sense reform? His answers were smooth, rehearsed, and effective. He was in his element. The Democrats on the committee tried to land blows, but their attacks were academic, focused on broad constitutional questions and potential impacts on major corporations. Hawley deflected them with ease, turning their arguments back on them. It's telling, he'd say with a slight shake of his head, that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem more concerned with the profit margins of Google than with the well-being of the American family. He was winning. The narrative was firmly under his control. Then, the chairman looked down his list. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Crockett, for 5 minutes. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward. The room quieted slightly. Her reputation for sharp, surgical questioning preceded her. The polished confidence on Hawley's face tightened just a fraction. He braced himself for a legalistic attack, perhaps on First Amendment grounds, or a procedural loophole. He was ready. Crockett looked not at him, but at the chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, she said, her voice calm and even. I have a few questions for the senator, but I believe they would be better asked by one of his own constituents. A ripple of confusion went through the room. This was not standard procedure. The chairman looked perplexed. I'm not sure I follow, Miss Crockett. Before he could object, Crockett continued, her voice gaining a hard edge of authority. Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence, I would like to yield the majority of my time to Mr. Leo Vance of Columbia, Missouri, who is seated in the front row. She turned her head slightly. Mr. Vance is a software developer and, until 3 weeks ago, was the CEO of his own small business in the senator's home state. I believe his experience with the Freedom to Compete Act is directly relevant to today's hearing. All eyes swiveled from Crockett to the terrified man in the ill-fitting suit. Leo Vance looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming train. On the dais, a Republican congressman started to sputter. Mr. Chairman, this is highly irregular. But the cameras were already zooming in on Leo. The narrative, so carefully controlled by Hawley, was suddenly skidding off the road. Crockett held the senator's gaze. It was a silent challenge. For him to object would look like he was afraid to hear from one of his own voters. Hawley, caught completely off guard, could do nothing but offer a tight, forced smile and a small nod. A prisoner of his own populist rhetoric, he had spent an hour talking about the forgotten man. Now, one was being asked to speak. The chairman, seeing the political trap, banged his gavel weakly. Without objection, he mumbled, the gentleman is recognized. Leo Vance stood up, his legs trembling. He fumbled with the clasp on his manila folder, his hands shaking so much he could barely open it. Crockett gave him a short, sharp nod from the dais. Breathe. Speak. He took a shaky breath, the microphone at the public witness table amplifying the sound. He looked directly at the man who had been a titan on his television screen just moments before. Senator Hawley, Leo began, his voice cracking before finding a fragile strength. He held up a sheaf of papers from the folder. They were stapled together, stamped with the seal of the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Western District of Missouri. My name is Leo Vance. I'm from your state. I voted for you. Hawley's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of rigid neutrality. He stared at Leo, his mind clearly racing, searching for a way to regain control. The room was utterly silent, save for the frantic clicking of press cameras. The trap had been sprung. I spent 5 years and every dime I had building an app to connect people in our community. Woodworkers, gardeners, people who fly kites. Good people. Your people. Leo's voice grew steadier, fueled by the adrenaline of a man with nothing left to lose. He was no longer just a spectator. He was the evidence. Your bill, the Freedom to Compete Act, it has a section, 4A's, on algorithmic certification. I'm sure you know it well. That section put a price tag of $75,000 a year on my business, a compliance cost I could never afford. My app is gone, Senator. My company is gone. My employees are gone. He paused, letting the words sink into the dead air of the hearing room. He then lifted the bankruptcy papers higher, the gesture a desperate salute to his own failure. Crockett watched, motionless, giving him the space to land the final, devastating blow. Leo Vance looked Hawley square in the eye, his voice now clear and ringing with the awful clarity of his ruin. Senator, you just said this would create jobs. Can you explain why the only thing it created for me was a $50,000 legal bill on top of my bankruptcy? The question hung in the air, a javelin thrown across the room that landed squarely in the heart of Hawley's narrative. For a long, stretched-out moment, the senator from Missouri said nothing. The architect of the law, the champion of the common man, was speechless. He stared at Leo Vance, the human collateral damage of his grand ideological project. The whirring and clicking of the cameras was the only sound, a mechanical chorus documenting a political takedown so swift and so total that no one knew what to do next. Hawley opened his mouth, then closed it. Any answer he gave would be wrong. If he defended the law, he was callous. If he sympathized, he was admitting his law was flawed. Jasmine Crockett had not just asked a question, she had presented a verdict. And in the court of public opinion, broadcast live on C-SPAN, Josh Hawley had just been found guilty. The chairman, desperate to stop the bleeding, banged his gavel. "The gentlewoman's time has expired," he barked, his voice tight with panic. But it was too late. The 5 minutes were over. But the story was just beginning. The clip was already being spliced, uploaded, and shared, the title writing itself. Senator Hawley confronted by bankrupt constituent he claimed to be helping. Jasmine Crockett leaned back in her chair. She didn't smile. Her work here was done. The chairman's panicked gavel strike was a starting pistol, not a finish line. The declaration that the gentlewoman's time has expired was technically true, but substantively irrelevant. The moment had been created, and it now owned the room. Josh Hawley, frozen at the witness table, looked like a man who had just watched a car crash in slow motion, only to realize he was the driver. His face, usually a mask of calm, intellectual certainty, was now a canvas of conflicting emotions, shock, fury, and a dawning horror at his own political miscalculation. He opened his mouth, a reflexive action to reclaim the narrative, to say something that could patch the gaping hole Leo Vance had just torn in his credibility. "Mr. Vance," Hawley began, his voice strained, losing its earlier baritone resonance. "My heart, of course, goes out to you and your family for your difficulties." The word hung in the air, a weak and insulting summary of a man's total financial ruin. But the purpose of this law, the greater purpose, is to protect millions of Missourians, millions of Americans, from the predatory practices of big tech monopolies. Sometimes, in a great and necessary undertaking, there are unfortunate and unintended consequences for a few. It was the worst possible thing he could have said. He had reduced Leo Vance from a constituent to an abstraction, a rounding error in his grand political equation. The photographer's cameras, sensing the kill, clicked with renewed ferocity. From the dais, Jasmine Crockett didn't need to speak. She simply scribbled a note on a piece of paper and slid it down the polished wood to the Democrat sitting next to her, a veteran congressman from California whose turn to question was next. The congressman, a man who normally specialized in tedious discussions of spectrum allocation, glanced at the note, his eyes widened slightly, and he leaned into his microphone. "Senator Hawley," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity, "following up on your heartfelt concern for your constituent, Mr. Vance. You call his bankruptcy an unfortunate consequence. The bill you authored and are championing here today includes specific language in Section 7, exempting corporations with over $10 billion in annual revenue from the immediate audit requirement, giving them a 2-year grace period to comply." He paused, letting Hawley's own words set the trap. "Could you explain to the committee why your bill gives a 2-year shield to Google and Facebook, but offered no protection at all for a small business owner from Columbia, Missouri? Was that also an unintended consequence? Or was it the design?" Checkmate. Hawley was cornered. The hypocrisy was laid bare for everyone to see here. He had given the giants a pass while crushing the little guy he claimed to champion. His mouth opened and closed again. He looked from the congressman to Crockett, who met his gaze with an unblinking stare. There was no pity in her eyes, only the cold, hard glint of accountability. That's a mischaracterization of the provision," Hawley stammered, launching into a defensive filibuster of legalistic jargon about phase-in periods and enforcement mechanisms. But no one was listening to the explanation. They had all heard the charge. The room erupted. The chairman hammered his gavel, shouting, "Order! Order in the committee!" Republican members were on their feet, yelling at the chairman, accusing Crockett of an unethical ambush and a disgraceful political stunt. Democrats were shouting back, demanding Hawley answer the question. It was no longer a hearing, it was a brawl. In the midst of the chaos, Josh Hawley stood up abruptly. He gathered no papers because he had brought none. He looked flustered, his composure shattered. "Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice tight with rage, "it is clear this committee is no longer interested in a substantive discussion, but in partisan theatrics." And with that, he turned and walked away from the witness table, striding quickly toward the exit, a retreat broadcast live across the nation. As the senator fled, Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat. She ignored the shouting of her colleagues and the frantic banging of the gavel. She walked down from the dais, navigating the sea of aides and staffers, and went directly to Leo Vance, who was still standing by the public microphone, looking utterly stunned by the storm he had unleashed. A mob of reporters, photographers, and cameramen, having abandoned the dying hearing, was already swarming toward them, a chaotic scrum of microphones and flashing lights. Crockett reached Leo and put a firm, steadying hand on his shoulder. "You did good, Mr. Vance," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the noise. "You did real good." She then turned to face the press, positioning herself slightly in front of Leo, a human shield. "Congresswoman, was this a setup?" a reporter shouted. "What did you hope to accomplish?" another yelled. Crockett held up a hand, and the cacophony subsided slightly. "You all just heard a United States senator admit that his signature legislation has what he calls unfortunate consequences for his own constituents," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "You heard him defend giving a 2-year grace period to the biggest corporations on earth, while a small business owner in his own state went bankrupt. Those aren't my words, they're his. The question you should be asking isn't for me. You should be asking Senator Hawley why he didn't know his own law was destroying the lives of the very people he swears he's fighting for. Ask him why he ran away from that question." She then tightened her grip on Leo's shoulder. "Come on, Mr. Vance, let's get you out of here." She forged a path through the media mob, who parted before her like the Red Sea, and led the dazed app developer out into the marble hallway, leaving the wreckage of the hearing behind them. Hours later, the adrenaline had long since faded, leaving behind the bone-deep exhaustion of a battle won. In Jasmine Crockett's office, the atmosphere was electric. Her young staff was buzzing, energized by the victory. Her communications director, a man named David, who lived and breathed for moments like this, was practically vibrating. "The numbers are insane, Jasmine," he said, holding up his phone to show her the analytics. "The clip has 12 million views on X alone. 12 million. Your follower count is up by 100,000 since noon. Every major network has led with the story. Rachel Maddow's producers just called. They want you for the top of the show tonight. Morning Joe wants you tomorrow. It's a home run." Crockett sat heavily in the chair behind her desk. The phone, David was waving in her face, a blur of meaningless charts and graphs. She offered a tired smile. "That's great, David. Great work." But she wasn't feeling the triumph. The victory in the hearing room was public, but the cost was always private. A bill that came due in the quiet hours after the cameras were turned off. While her staff celebrated the political win, she was scrolling through the direct messages and mentions on her own phone, the ones David's cheerful analytics didn't show. The feed was a toxic sewer of hatred, racist slurs, misogynistic threats, and detailed fantasies of violence, much of it illustrated with vile, AI-generated images. "You're a dead woman. We know where your family lives. Someone needs to shut that loudmouth up for good." It was the predictable, ugly backlash that came whenever she made waves. A tidal wave of anonymous rage that left a film of grime on her spirit. Her desk phone rang and she flinched. It was her personal line. The caller ID showed her older sister's name. She took a deep breath and answered. "Hey sis." "Jasmine, don't you—" "Hey sis me." Her sister's voice came through, tight with worry. "I just saw you on the news. It's all over the place. Are you okay? The things they're saying about you online. It's terrifying." Crockett closed her eyes, leaning her head back against her chair. She could picture her sister, pacing in her kitchen in Houston, twisting a dish towel in her hands. "I'm fine, Keisha. It's just politics." "That wasn't just politics, Jers. That man looked like he wanted to kill you. And the people who love him, they're crazy. You have to be more careful. You have a family. You have nieces who adore you." The words, meant with love, felt like another weight. "Keisha? That man, Leo? The one who was with me? He has a family too," Crockett said, her voice low and weary, "and his life was ruined. Because nobody with a microphone was willing to stand up and say it was wrong. If I don't do it, who will? If I start getting scared off by some racist trolls on the internet, then they've already won. It's the whole point." There was a long silence on the line. "I know," Keisha said, her voice softening. "I know you're right. That doesn't mean I don't worry. Just call me when you get home, okay? Just so I know you're home safe." "I will," Crockett promised. "I love you." "I love you too. Now go save the world or whatever. Just don't forget to lock your doors." She hung up the phone and stared at the darkened window of her office, seeing her own reflection. The fire she felt in the hearing room had banked to embers. Victory felt less like a celebration and more like the grim satisfaction of a surgeon who has just completed a long and bloody operation. The disease had been excised, but the patient was still on the table, and the scars would remain. Meanwhile, in a sterile Marriott hotel room a few miles away, Leo Vance was experiencing his own surreal aftermath. He sat on the edge of the king-size bed, watching himself on a giant flat-screen TV. A panel of experts on CNN was dissecting his exchange with Senator Hawley. A woman with sharp glasses called him a powerful new symbol of populist discontent. A man in a bow tie argued he was a pawn in a cynical Democratic game. They were talking about him, Leo Vance, from Columbia, Missouri, like he was a concept. He looked down at his own hands. They were still trembling. His bankruptcy was no longer a private shame. It was a national news story, a data point in a political war he never wanted to join. His phone, a cheap Android he'd bought after he had to sell his iPhone, buzzed incessantly on the nightstand. It was a flood of messages from numbers he didn't recognize. Strangers offering support. Old high school friends he hadn't spoken to in 20 years. And reporters. So many reporters, all wanting an exclusive interview with the man who stood up to Hawley. He felt a surge of nausea. He hadn't stood up to anyone. He had been drowning, and Congresswoman Crockett had thrown him a line. He had simply spoken his truth out of desperation. He never wanted this. He just wanted to build his app, to connect the quilters and the kite flyers. His wife, Sarah, called. He answered immediately. "Leo! Oh my God, Leo, I saw it! Are you all right?" she asked, her voice a mix of terror and awe. I'm okay," he said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. "It was crazy, Sarah. He was just sitting there. I can't believe I did it." "I can," she said, and for the first time he heard a note of fierce pride in her voice. "You told the truth, honey. You told our story. I'm so proud of you." He felt tears welling in his eyes, the first he had allowed himself to shed through the whole ordeal. The bankruptcy, the shame, the fear, it all came pouring out. "But what now, Sarah?" he whispered into the phone. "What happens now? My business is still gone. We still have those bills. Now the whole world is watching us fail." The TV panel was still talking about him, their voices a meaningless drone. He was a symbol now. But symbols don't pay the mortgage. The first 72 hours after the hearing were a political trench war. Josh Hawley's office, staffed with some of the most battle-hardened communicators in Washington, launched a ferocious counteroffensive. A blizzard of press releases descended on newsrooms, condemning the premeditated and shameful ambush, and accusing Jasmine Crockett of cynically exploiting a financially troubled individual for partisan gain. Hawley himself appeared on the highest-rated news program in conservative media, his face a mask of solemn resolve. He didn't deny Leo Vance's story. Instead, he absorbed it into his narrative, recasting it as proof of the war's necessity. "This is what happens when you take on the most powerful corporations in the history of the world," he told the sympathetic host. "They fight back. They use their allies in the mainstream media and in the Democratic Party to create chaos, to find isolated incidents, and blow them out of proportion to distract from the real issue. My heart breaks for Mr. Vance. But my mission to protect our children and our country from big tech's poison will not be deterred by these political games." It was a masterful pivot. The narrative was now muddy, a he said, she said battle line drawn across the media landscape. On one side, Crockett was a hero, a modern-day David who had given a voice to the voiceless. On the other, she was a ruthless operative who had weaponized a man's personal tragedy. Leo Vance, a man who just wanted to code an app for hobbyists, found his face and bankruptcy filings plastered across screens as Exhibit A in a war he barely understood. The story was in danger of being consumed by the toxic, partisan sludge that drowns everything in Washington, becoming just another fleeting outrage before the next one came along. Jasmine Crockett knew this. She fielded the calls, did the interviews, and stuck to her message. But she could feel the momentum stalling, the concrete facts of Leo's ruin dissolving into the abstract fog of political spins. The change came not from a politician, but from a place Josh Hawley never saw it coming, his own ideological backyard. It arrived on the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal in the form of an 800-word op-ed by Nathan Blackwood. Blackwood was a titan in the conservative business world, the founder of a Utah-based data analytics firm that had made him a billionaire. He was a self-made man, a major Republican donor, and a frequent guest at think tanks where he was lauded as a true conservative innovator. He was, in short, unimpeachable. The title of his piece was A Surgical Strike. Senator Hawley is right about big tech. He is wrong on how to fight it. Blackwood began by praising Hawley's diagnosis of the problem, agreeing that the unchecked power of Silicon Valley was a threat to free markets and free speech. Then he pivoted, and with the cold precision of a surgeon, he vivisected Hawley's solution. The Freedom to Compete Act, he wrote, was not a conservative piece of legislation. It was a Trojan horse for big government. He argued that the law's complex, expensive, and vague compliance requirements did not challenge big tech. They entrenched it. Google has 1,000 compliance lawyers, Blackwood wrote. They can absorb the cost of a new regulatory regime. In fact, they welcome it, because it builds a wall against new competition. The law's first victim was not Google, but Leo Vance of HobbyHub, a Missouri-based startup. This was not a tragic, unintended consequence, as Senator Hawley claims. It was the law's most predictable outcome. It is a feature, not a bug, of legislation that prefers the bureaucratic baton to the dynamism of the free market. True conservative reform would slash regulations to unleash innovators like Mr. Vance, not create new ones that only the Goliaths can afford. The Freedom to Compete Act is not a blow against the tech monopolies. It is a gift to them, wrapped in the flag of populism. The op-ed detonated with the force of a tactical nuke. It blew the partisan framing to pieces. Suddenly, the debate was no longer just Democrats versus Hawley. It was now a schism on the right. A fundamental argument about the nature of conservatism itself. Nathan Blackwood had given Republicans, business leaders, and conservative intellectuals the intellectual cover they needed to criticize the bill. Without being labeled defenders of big tech, the dam broke. A trade association representing over 5,000 small tech startups released a statement echoing Blackwood's concerns. Two Republican congressmen on the Energy and Commerce Committee, who had previously praised Hawley, publicly announced they would be seeking significant amendments to the House version of the bill. The narrative Hawley had fought so hard to control was not just lost, it was now being dictated by his own side. This was the opening Jasmine Crockett had been waiting for. Her staff urged her to go on a major news network, to take a victory lap, to hammer Hawley now that he was vulnerable. She refused. "This isn't about me," she told her communications director. "And it's not about him either. Not anymore." She had a different plan. She wasn't going to spike the football from a television studio in New York. She was going to take the debate back to the place where it started. 2 days later, Jasmine Crockett was not in Washington. She was standing in the crisp autumn air of a generic suburban office park in Columbia, Missouri. The backdrop was not the grand dome of the U.S. Capitol, but a 2-story beige building with a small, now empty office on the ground floor. A paper sign with the HobbyHub logo was still taped to the inside of the glass door. Next to her, looking terrified but resolute, stood Leo Vance. He was in his own clothes now, a simple fleece jacket and jeans. He was home. A small cluster of local and national reporters gathered on the manicured lawn, their cameras pointed at the Congresswoman from Texas and the bankrupt coder from Missouri. Crockett stepped up to the single microphone her aide had set up. She looked tired, but her voice was firm. She began, not with an attack, but with a word of thanks. "I want to thank Nathan Blackwood for his intellectual honesty," she said. "He and I would probably disagree on 90% of issues. But on this, he spoke a fundamental truth, that we cannot allow our government to crush innovation and opportunity in the name of any ideology." She then turned and gestured toward the empty office behind her. For the past week, there has been a lot of talk in Washington about what happened in that hearing room. There's been a lot of finger-pointing, a lot of political spin, but the pundits and politicians yelling at each other on TV seem to have forgotten that this whole debate is about this. She pointed again at the door. "It's about this empty office. It's about the jobs that were lost here. It's about a man who had a good idea and the courage to pursue it, right here in the heart of this country." She looked directly into the cameras, her gaze unflinching. She was no longer just a congresswoman or a partisan combatant. She was a teacher, a former defender, making her closing argument. This was never about being anti-tech or pro-tech. It was never about Democrats versus Republicans. It was about a simple, fundamental principle that seems to get lost in the noise of Washington. A government's first duty is to its people, not to an abstract theory. The laws we write, the bills we pass, they aren't just words on paper. They have names and addresses attached to them. They have consequences that are felt around kitchen tables in Columbia, Missouri, and Dallas, Texas, and every town in between. She paused, letting the silence hold for a beat. Leo Vance stood beside her, a living testament to her words. "We were sent to Washington to solve problems, not to create them. We were sent to clear the path for Americans to succeed, not to lay traps for them." Mr. Vance's only mistake was believing in the American dream, in the idea that if he worked hard and built something good, he would have a chance to succeed. The Freedom to Compete Act turned that dream into a nightmare of compliance costs and legal threats. My goal, and the goal of a growing number of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, is to ensure that never, ever happens again. We can and we must do better." She finished speaking. She didn't take questions. She simply gave Leo Vance's shoulder a slight squeeze, turned, and walked back to her waiting rental car, leaving her words to echo across the quiet office park. A definitive statement that rose above the noise and redefined the entire fight. The battle was no longer about a 5-minute clip. It was about the future of American innovation and the fundamental responsibilities of power. The Missouri press conference was the turning point. In Washington, a statement delivered at a podium in the Capitol is just noise, easily dismissed as partisan posturing. But a statement delivered on the pavement outside the very business a law has destroyed, with the business's ruined owner standing beside you, is a fact on the ground. It has weight. It has gravity. And it pulled Senator Josh Hawley's narrative crashing back to earth. The pressure, now coming from his own political flank and amplified by the stark visual of Leo Vance's shuttered dream, became unbearable. 2 days after Crockett's appearance in Columbia, Hawley's office released a carefully worded statement. It was a masterpiece of political retreat, disguised as magnanimous leadership. He announced that after listening to the concerns of small business innovators, he was fully open to working with his colleagues in the House to amend the bill to ensure emerging enterprises are nurtured, not burdened. He insisted his intent was never to harm small businesses, a quiet but profound concession. The war was over, and he had lost. Inside his Senate office, the confident hum of a well-oiled political machine had been replaced by the tense quiet of a command center after a rout. Aides who had been celebrating the polls just a week prior now spoke in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact with the senator. The architect of the grand populist crusade had been forced to admit his blueprint was flawed, a humiliating public reversal. The defeat was not just legislative, it was personal. He had been outmaneuvered not by a Senate peer or a big tech lobbyist, but by a junior congresswoman from Texas, and a coder he had never bothered to meet. He had wrapped himself in the mantle of the common man, and that same man had been used to unravel him completely. For Leo Vance, the senator's concession was a strange, hollow victory. It didn't magically reopen his business or repay his debts. But it did something else. His phone, which had been a source of anxiety, was now a lifeline to a world he never knew existed. He began receiving emails and direct messages from dozens of other small tech entrepreneurs, not just in Missouri, but in Ohio, Florida, and Tennessee. They had all been terrified by the Freedom to Compete Act, quietly spending money they didn't have on legal consultations, trying to figure out how to comply with a law that seemed designed to make them fail. They had been too small, too isolated, too scared to speak up. Until now. Leo, the reluctant symbol, became a reluctant organizer. He started a private signal group, the Hawley's Law Survivors Club. It was a grimly humorous name for a group of people whose livelihoods were on the brink. He found himself on late-night Zoom calls, not talking about code, but about legal strategy and media outreach. He saw his own fear and desperation reflected in the faces of a dozen other entrepreneurs on his screen. "I didn't know what to do," a woman from Nashville who ran a small music-sharing platform told him. "I was about to just shut it all down. Then I saw you on TV, and I thought, my God, I'm not the only one." Leo, who had felt like the loneliest man in America, was suddenly a leader of a small digital rebellion. He was finding a new purpose, forged in the ashes of his old one. Jasmine Crockett saw the opportunity Hawley's retreat had created. A political victory is only meaningful if it is translated into permanent change. With the momentum squarely on her side, she went to work. She reached out not to the firebrands in her own caucus, but to the moderate Republican congressman from California, the one who had read her note and clinically dismantled Hawley on the dais. She brought in her legislative counsel and, in a move that further scrambled the partisan calculus, invited a policy expert from Nathan Blackwood's team to join the discussions. The meetings were not televised. There were no reporters. It was the quiet, unglamorous work of governing. They huddled in a small conference room in the Capitol basement, fueled by bad coffee and a shared, pragmatic goal. There were arguments over wording, debates about revenue thresholds, but there was no yelling. It was a negotiation, not a performance. The result was a 2-page document called the Small Business Safe Harbor Amendment. It was a model of legislative clarity. The amendment proposed a simple, bright-line rule. Any technology company with less than $20 million in annual revenue and fewer than 50 employees would be completely exempt from the algorithmic audit requirement. In its place, they would be required to complete a simple, 1-page online registration form with the FTC, certifying their algorithm was not designed for political censorship or addictive engagement. It was a shield for the Leos of the world, a simple, effective solution that accomplished Hawley's stated goal, transparency, without the business-killing side effects. It was smart. It was targeted. And because it had bipartisan parentage and the blessing of a conservative billionaire, it was politically bulletproof. 1 week later, the amendment was introduced on the floor of the House of Representatives. The debate was brief and, by Washington standards, remarkably civil. The Republican congressman from California introduced it, calling it a common-sense fix to protect our nation's innovators. Jasmine Crockett spoke in support, framing it as a testament to what we can achieve when we focus on solving problems for the American people instead of scoring political points. A few Republicans, still loyal to Hawley's original vision, grumbled about weakening the bill, but they were a small minority. The tide had turned. The amendment passed with a staggering vote of 382 to 49. It was a landslide, a rare moment of overwhelming bipartisan consensus. In the House gallery, Leo Vance sat with Crockett's chief of staff, watching the vote tally on the electronic board. When the final number came in, he didn't cheer. He simply bowed his head and cried. A silent catharsis for a battle he never sought but had helped to win. The law that had destroyed his company was now neutered, its teeth pulled before it could savage anyone else. The story, for Washington, was over. The news cycle moved on, but the echo of that moment, of a single citizen's testimony and a single politician's resolve, was just beginning to travel. Miles away, in a glass and steel tower in downtown Houston, a 28-year-old lawyer named Maya Sharma sat in her cubicle, staring at a spreadsheet. Her job was to review discovery documents for a massive energy corporation engaged in litigation against a smaller rival. It was a war of attrition, and her role was to help her client win by burying the other side in paper. It paid off her staggering law school debt, but it was slowly grinding her soul into a fine powder. She had gone to law school, inspired by stories of Thurgood Marshall and the fight for civil rights. She had ended up a well-paid, deeply unhappy cog in a corporate machine. She had followed the story of Crockett and Hawley with a growing fascination. She watched the C-SPAN clip of the hearing on her lunch break, not once, but 5 times. She saw the terror in Leo Vance's eyes, the cold fury in Jasmine Crockett's. She saw a lawyer, a black woman like herself, using her power not to crush, but to defend. She read Nathan Blackwood's op-ed and saw how a principled argument could reframe an entire debate. She saw the news that the amendment had passed and felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. It was a feeling so foreign it was almost painful. She realized that the law didn't have to be a sword for the powerful. It could still be a shield for the vulnerable. It all depended on who was wielding it. That evening, Maya went home to her small apartment, bypassing the stack of legal files she was supposed to review over the weekend. She opened her laptop. The glow of the screen, a small light in her dim living room. She didn't open her work email. Instead, she typed Texas Civil Rights Project into the search bar. She clicked on the careers page. There was a listing for a staff attorney, specializing in economic justice cases. The salary was less than a third of what she was making now. It would mean a smaller apartment, an older car, a life with less financial security. But perhaps, she thought, more of a soul. She stared at the listing for a long time, and she opened a blank document and began to write a cover letter. "To whom it may concern," she typed. "For my entire career I have practiced law, but after watching Congresswoman Crockett fight for Leo Vance, I was reminded of why I wanted to become a lawyer in the first place. To fight for people, not for spreadsheets." She wrote for an hour, the words pouring out of her, a torrent of pent-up idealism. With a deep breath, a prayer, and a sense of terrifying, exhilarating freedom, she attached her resume and hit send. The action was small, private, and would never make the news, but it was a direct and lasting echo of the confrontation in that hearing room. A signal that had traveled from Washington, D.C. to Columbia, Missouri, and finally landed in a Houston apartment, inspiring one person to change her life, in the hope of changing the lives of others. The real victory wasn't just in amending a law, but in reminding a young lawyer what the law was for. The passage of the Small Business Safe Harbor Amendment was a definitive legislative victory, a rare punctuation mark of clarity in the run-on sentence of Washington politics. For Jasmine Crockett, however, it was not an ending. Her takedown of Hawley had inadvertently turned a spotlight on her, and with that spotlight came a new level of expectation and a different kind of challenge. Her reputation within the Democratic caucus had transformed overnight. She was no longer just the sharp-witted freshman from Texas. She was now seen as a legislative giant killer, a strategist who understood how to fight and win in the modern media arena. This new status became apparent a week after the amendment passed. She was in a Democratic caucus meeting when the House Minority Whip, a man with 3 decades of experience navigating the treacherous currents of Congress, pulled her aside. "Jasmine," he said, his voice a low conspiratorial rumble, "that was a masterclass, a damn masterclass." He wasn't just offering praise, he was recruiting. "We're getting stonewalled on the new telecom bill. The big carriers are running their usual playbook, framing our consumer protection language as an attack on the free market. It's not sticking, but it's slowing us down. I need someone to cut through the noise. We need some of that public defender energy you brought to the Hawley fight. Can you take a look at the bill? See if you can find the pressure point, the Leo Vance in the details?" It was a significant gesture, an admission from the old guard that the nature of the fight had changed, and she was one of its new pioneers. The victory had earned her a seat at the table, where the real battles were planned. Yet Crockett was acutely aware of the danger of becoming a Washington character, a cable news gladiator defined only by her highest-profile fights. The following weekend, she flew back to her district in Texas. There were no national cameras waiting for her, no reporters shouting questions. Her first event was a town hall at a local VFW hall in South Dallas. The room was filled with about 70 people, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee. The concerns were not about populist ideology or tech monopolies. A woman asked about the endless delays in getting her husband's disability benefits from the VA. A man complained about a new flight path from the local airport that sent planes rattling over his house at 6 a.m. Small business owner was tangled in red tape trying to get a federal disaster loan after a flood. This was the work. It was unglamorous, painstaking, and invisible to the national media, but to Crockett, it was the entire point. Toward the end of the meeting, an elderly veteran in a worn-out Marine Corps cap stood up. "Congresswoman," he said, his voice raspy, "I just wanted to thank you, man. My grandson, he got accepted into the Naval Academy. There was a snag with his paperwork, some bureaucratic nonsense. We called your office. A young lady named Maria spent 3 weeks on the phone, every single day. She got it fixed." The man's eyes welled up. "He starts in August. Thank you." Crockett smiled, a genuine, warm smile that the C-SPAN cameras rarely captured. "Thank you for your family's service, sir," she said. "That's why we're here." In that moment, the fight against Josh Hawley and the fight for a veteran's grandson were one and the same. They were both about pushing back against a large, impersonal system that had forgotten the name and address of the person it was supposed to serve. For Josh Hawley, the public retreat was a strategic repositioning, not a surrender. He was too disciplined a political fighter to be sidelined for long. In the weeks following the amendment's passage, he huddled with his core team. The mood was grim but focused. He acknowledged the mistake. Not with remorse, but with cold analysis. "We allowed them to isolate a single point of failure," he told his senior aide, the one who had tried to warn him. "We let Crockett and this developer control the frame. It won't happen again." His mind was already moving to the next battlefield. He couldn't reclaim the tech regulation issue, so he would pivot. He would find a new enemy, a new front in his populist war. He found it in the corporate world's embrace of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, initiatives. It was the perfect target. Unpopular with his base, easy to caricature, and it allowed him to position himself once again as the defender of the common man against woke capital. He announced the formation of a new Senate subcommittee under his leadership to investigate the impact of divisive corporate policies on American workers. He was back on the offensive, his rhetoric just as sharp, his conviction just as absolute. He had learned from his loss not to be more careful with people's lives, but to be more careful with his legislative language, to build his fortresses without any obvious weaknesses for a Jasmine Crockett to exploit. The real cost of his defeat, however, came not in a committee room, but at a weekend barbecue in his own neighborhood in Missouri. He was standing by the grill, talking about football with a neighbor, a dentist he had known for a decade. The neighbor took a long sip of his beer and said casually, "Hey Josh, that fella from Columbia, the computer guy. Leo Vance. My nephew went to college with him, said he was a good guy. That was a tough look for you." The comment was not hostile. It was just an observation, delivered with the blunt honesty of a long-time acquaintance. But it landed with more force than any attack on cable news. This wasn't a political pundit. This was a neighbor, a friend, someone from his own community reflecting the story back at him, not as a political win or loss, but as a matter of local reputation. For a brief, unguarded moment, the armor cracked. The senator simply nodded, his smile tight. "Yeah," he said, staring at the charcoal. "It was a tough one." Leo Vance, meanwhile, was drowning. The Hawley's Law Survivors Club had grown from 12 people to over 100. He was the de facto leader, a role he never asked for and felt wholly unqualified for. His days were a blur of Zoom calls and long email chains. He was part grief counselor, part amateur legal advisor, part community organizer. He listened to stories of people who had mortgaged their homes to fund their startups, who now faced ruin because of a law they didn't understand. The work was vital and all-consuming. It gave him a sense of purpose, but it didn't pay the bills that were still piling up on his kitchen table. His wife Sarah watched with a mixture of pride and deep anxiety as he poured all his energy into this new, unpaid, and emotionally draining job. One evening she came into his home office, a corner of their bedroom, and put a cup of coffee on his desk. He was on the phone, patiently walking a woman from Idaho through the fine print of the new Safe Harbor Amendment. He looked exhausted, the skin around his eyes thin and pale. "You can't save everyone, Leo," she whispered to him after he hung up. "I know," he said, rubbing his tired eyes. "But I have to try. No one else is going to." The lifeline came from the most unexpected of places. An email appeared in his inbox with the subject line, "A conversation." The sender was Nathan Blackwood. Leo, stunned, agreed to a video call. The next day, he found himself staring at the face of the Utah billionaire. Blackwood was direct and unsentimental. "Mr. Vance," he said, "you've done something remarkable. You've organized a constituency out of thin air. That's a rare talent." He then made his pitch. His foundation was prepared to provide the seed funding, a $2 million grant, to establish a new nonprofit organization. It would be called the American Innovation Alliance, a formal advocacy group for small tech entrepreneurs. It would have a real budget, a real staff, and a real office in Washington, D.C. "We need a permanent voice fighting for the little guy in this space," Blackwood said, and I think you should be its first executive director." Leo was speechless. He thought of the bills on his table, of the exhausted faces on his Zoom calls. This offer wasn't just a job. It was a chance to turn his painful, accidental activism into a sustainable, powerful force for change. He looked at Sarah, who had been listening just off camera. She was crying silently, a huge, relieved smile on her face. "Yes," Leo said, his voice thick with emotion. "Mr. Blackwood, yes, I accept." He had lost his company, but he had found his calling. In Houston, Maya Sharma got the email she had been praying for. The Texas Civil Rights Project wanted to interview her. A week later, she walked into their office. It was a world away from the silent, air-conditioned luxury of her corporate law firm. The office was a chaotic warren of cubicles, the walls covered in protest posters and news clippings. The phones rang constantly. The energy was frayed but electric. She was interviewed by the project's legal director, a woman named Elena, who had deep-set, tired eyes, but a gaze that missed nothing. Elena had her resume in her hand. "This is an impressive resume, Miss Sharma," Elena said, her tone neutral. "Big firm, top of your class. So tell me why you want to trade it all in for long hours, low pay, and cases the world is designed for you to lose." It was a test. "A lot of corporate lawyers get burned out and think this work is romantic," Elena continued, her eyes boring into Maya. "It's not. It's a grind. Are you ready for that?" Maya took a breath. "I spent the last 2 years helping a company with $10 billion in assets grind a company with $10 million into the dust over a patent dispute," she said, her voice steady. "I know what a grind is. The difference is who you're grinding for." She leaned forward slightly. "I saw what Congresswoman Crockett did for Leo Vance, and I know it was just one case, one moment. But for me it was a reminder that the law isn't just a set of abstract concepts. It's a set of rules that govern people's lives, and what matters is whether we use those rules to build people up or tear them down. I want to spend the rest of my career building people up." Elena listened, her expression unreadable. She was silent for a long moment after Maya finished. "Good answer," she finally said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Welcome to the fight." Maya Sharma's first day at the Texas Civil Rights Project was the first Monday of the following month. The grand, sweeping view of the Houston skyline from her old office was replaced by a view of a brick wall. Her mahogany desk was replaced by a beat-up metal one, but the sense of dread that used to accompany her Monday mornings was gone, replaced by a nervous, thrilling sense of purpose. Elena dropped a thick, dog-eared file on her desk. "Here's your first one," she said. "The Ramos family. They're facing eviction from their apartment. The landlord is claiming they violated their lease, but the real reason is they organized a tenants association to complain about a mold problem. It's a classic retaliation case. The landlord has one of the biggest law firms in the city on retainer. It's you against them. Good luck." Maya opened the folder. Inside were photos of a crumbling apartment, pictures of sick children, and copies of threatening letters from a corporate law firm, not unlike the one she had just left. The odds were long. The fight would be a brutal, uphill battle. But as she read the first page of Mr. Ramos's affidavit, Maya Sharma felt not a shred of doubt. The echo of the fight that had begun in a hearing room in Washington had reached her, not as a sound, but as a calling. She picked up her pen and began to make her notes. The work had begun. What is the true cost of speaking truth to power? And who ultimately pays the price? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that go beyond the headlines.